is a real, or feigned, resurgence of secular right common sense politics, en route to the needful spiritual awakening. Bruce Charlton. There is, for a month, what superficially appears to be a resurgence of secular right common sense politics from the USA, i.e. a politics rhetorically rooted in national economic and societal self-interest, and this is depicted, by some of its supporters, as being the first step in a rebuilding of Christendom, therefore a stage en route to the much-needed spiritual awakening. Putting aside that this secular right revival is, I believe, feigned not real, and that this will soon become evident, even if we were to accept it at face value, then is it a good thing spiritually? We cannot expect any answer to this question from studying individual policies, for example by trying to infer an implicit coherent net strategy behind the flurry of apparent contradictions. As always, we need to infer underlying intentions, motivations etc., which are rooted in the nature and affiliations of those persons and groups making the statements and policies. If, however, we assume for the sake of argument that we are witnessing a genuine attempt to build a stronger secular society, a society that is clearing the ground of the self-hating and self-destroying post-60s new leftism, and if we assume that this is being done in order to promote the material well-being of nations, we can then ask from a Christian perspective whether, if it is intended and could happen, this would be a good thing. Would it be a good thing if the USA could become a stronger nation, characterized by enhanced military power, secure borders, enforcement of law and order, a more efficient, more meritocratic, more genuinely productive, and more homegrown economy etc.? Would this kind of material improvement actually be a good thing for the spiritual status of its people, and of the world? On the surface, the answer seems obvious, that such a society would be preferable to what has been the case for the past several decades. But on the other side, we also need to look ahead. We need to ask whether a stronger and more cohesive, but still fundamentally materialist, godless, acquisitive, consumerist, comfortable, better entertained, techno-totalitarian society would really be a good thing. We need to ask whether this is what is most needed, here, now? Whether the vast human effort and attention, bribery and compulsion, involved in striving for such change to such a society, is not very badly misplaced. And most fundamentally to ask whether this is possible at all. Given all that we should have learned by now, about the innate self-destructiveness and evil tendencies of any and all such societies. After all, the strong, increasingly godless, rapidly growing USA of the 1950s was exactly this sort of success story. Yet, even at that time, in the mid-20th century, it was clear to thoughtful and observant Christians and secular people alike, that it just would not do, and was inevitably doomed to go, more or less, exactly where it actually went. There are many examples of such analysis, but one will suffice: Nihilism by Eugene Rose, later Father Seraphim. People here and now need to step back from immediate, and substantially manipulated, emotionality, and instead consider such long-term, strategic, spiritual matters, because we can be sure that those who practice the dark arts of geopolitics are already doing so. Note, those with memories that extend back more than a few months, ought to have learned that having some public figure speaking some or several specific factual truths, or refuting one or a few of the innumerable lies of mainstream leftism, does not amount to anything at all, in terms of indicating a trend towards a truthful, honest, more good society. When underlying metaphysical assumptions are poisonous, then debates over particular assertions are always utterly ineffectual. The scope of aphorisms. Bruce Charlton. I have often recommended aphoristic writers. And I have, at least since I began regular blogging in 2010, a year or two after I became a Christian, myself developed an aphoristic style of writing, as may be evident by comparing my earlier writing. So, I need no persuading of the virtues of aphorism. However, there are limitations on the effectiveness and value of this type of writing. An aphorism only takes the reader so far and to an uncertain destination. Why? Because really to comprehend, we must see the workings of thinking. The ideal is not to present conclusions merely, but that the reader, through the process of reading, participates in the thought processes of the writer. Therefore, the best use of aphorisms comes when they are presented in some quantity, and in a sequence that represents the movement of the author's thought. When this is done well, a reader can get benefit from the journey, even when the destination turns out to be a place he dislikes. Note, the first aphoristic text that grabbed me was Wittgenstein's On Certainty, which is derived from notes made on a few occasions, jumping around a problem, tackling it by rushes, from different angles. I can't remember Wittgenstein's conclusions, if any, but I appreciated the way he tackled the business. Do more good than a grand coalition of Christian churches and monarchies ever could. Francis Berger. I recently encountered a blog post that, correctly, warned Christians against eagerly forming alliances with secular right-wing/alt-right types. Sorry, I can't recall where I read the post. I am of the same view, however. The post in question then promoted the cultivation of Christian alliances to attain the same sort of this worldly social/political aims the secular right/alt-right types pine for. I couldn't help but shake my head upon reading that. The mere notion of allying with Christians who marinate their expressed aims in the same sort of grand, civilizational level, this worldly concerns as the secular right, is anathema to me. They are choosing the wrong way, a way Badiaf describes in the following manner.
There are two ways. One is that of the love of man, which wants to make men happy, to calm and organize them, to build comfortable housing for their neighbors where they will forget their irrational and tragic freedom, will renounce their right to absolute, supermundane truth. This is the way of the Grand Inquisitor. It leads to the anthill where there will be neither freedom nor personality.
For the sake of brevity, I will forego wading into the laughable delusions fueling noble pipe dreams of a resurrected future Christendom forged by sturdy Christian alliances determined to alter the social and political landscape in God's name, and focus instead on what Christian alliances ought to be and should focus on in this time and place. To get the ball rolling, I turn, once again, to Badiaf.
The other is the way of the love of God that wants to liberate men and puts truth and superhuman values above prosperity and the ordering of life. This is the way of him who came with words of boundless freedom and was a reminder that God and freedom and truth are above the well-being and tranquility of men. And we must choose either the philanthropic way of well-being or the God-loving way of freedom.
The only Christian alliances that interest me in this time and place are those that place the spiritual aspects of following Jesus well above human tranquility and the ordering of this worldly life. Such alliances are inevitably personal and compact. As such, they do perceptibly little to alter the course of world history. Still, I am convinced that the workings within such intimate, spiritually focused affiliations and collaborations ultimately achieve a higher level of good in this world, and the next, than any grand coalition of contemporary Christian churches and monarchies ever could. Classical Theology, The Great Liberator. Francis Berger. Classical Theology's Greatest Achievement. Liberating Men from Freedom. The litmus tests are really learning opportunities. Bruce Charlton. The litmus tests to which I so often refer on this blog are a mixture of old and new. They are continually being added to. I first conceptualized them in 2020 in reference to the Birdemic and Peck, which were added onto much longer established totalitarian establishment strategies, such as pacifism, socialism, feminism and sexual revolution, anti-racism, climate change, etc. Since 2020 there have been further litmus tests, such as, especially in the UK, the war against the Fire Nation. And currently there is a litmus test with reference to taking sides in the civil war that is splitting the globalist materialists of the totalitarian establishment. Or apparently so, because the civil war may ultimately, at the highest level, be a faked show put on to manipulate the masses. It is pretty clear that the litmus tests never stop. As commenter Liath has said, each new test probes for different vulnerabilities among those people, and institutions, who had been able to hold out against being assimilated into active support to the totalitarian agenda. Thus the healthism of the Birdemic/PEC led to the corruption of most of the holdouts among mainstream Christian churches. Conservative Catholics, evangelicals and Mormons that had resisted the sexual revolution, became wildly enthusiastic about closing their churches and suspending activities until further notice, and imposing lockdown, atomistic social isolation, and habits of systematic interpersonal fear. Later, some of those who had successfully resisted the Birdemic manipulations, then joined with a nationally orchestrated, media-constructed, Orwellian 2-minute hate session against the Fire Nation, a 2 minutes that has continued for 3 years, so far, and which is still actively attempting to create a self-annihilating all-out state of war, with the UK as prime target. The current situation with the new president in the USA, is but the most recent litmus test. This has, like previous tests, been able to subvert and turn a significant proportion of those holdouts who had resisted the Birdemic and Fire Nation tests. It seems that perhaps a majority of based online anti-woke, self-identified Christians, have gone all in for an almost delirious combination of schadenfreude with this worldly optimism, the whole thing focused on various antichrist figures among the mainstream, totalitarian establishment. In one sense these litmus tests can be understood as an almost inevitable consequence of the increasing power of Satan and his demons and human servants within this world. Clearly, they will continue to win more and more souls to an more certain, self-chosen, damnation. On the other hand, they may perhaps be seen as tests allowed by God, because of the opportunities each one brings for a different kind of spiritual learning, and therefore spiritual development, and education in preparation for our post-mortal resurrected life. Which education is, emo, the purpose of our sustained mortal life. We each continue to live because we have more that it would be good, and perhaps essential, for us to learn. However, I personally do not see the litmus test as allowed by God nor as a divinely ordained method of spiritual education. Instead I see them as things that God cannot prevent, in this world as it actually is. My understanding is, the litmus tests originate variously, but become strategies due to their potential for evil, and are sustained for that reason. They are not of God, but God can and does, as always, make the best of the bad situations that result, because of His love for each of us, as His divine children. And we should take the same attitude of making the best spiritual use of the situations. We should regard the litmus tests as direct challenges, not to our peace/prosperity/comfort/convenience, but challenges to our innermost spiritual freedom, the primacy of Christian love, and the requirement for absolute personal responsibility. The core part of this is realizing that, for all their geopolitical qualities, the litmus tests are not primarily about material circumstances for large numbers of people in this world. On the contrary, their true primary reality is directed at the free individual human soul, who always can and needs to discern reality in and for himself, whatever the pressures and distractions of this material and social world. Note, as I have previously said, the special significance of litmus tests, as with all temptations to sin, is that failure on even a single test can be sufficient to induce a person to reject salvation and choose damnation. Therefore, it is a misunderstanding to express satisfaction that some particular person or institution has passed one, or several, or a majority of the litmus tests. In principle and in practice, even when just a single litmus test is failed, then that may be a sufficient basis for corruption and inversion of values. And this is made much more likely because the global totalitarian establishment will reward and amplify any such failure to convert passive acquiesce into active support. There is no hope in this world. William Wildblood. There is no time more spiritually perilous than when you get what you want. In bad times you can more easily turn to God as the world is not offering you anything, but when the world does offer you something, whether that be money, fame, power or even the kind of political success that you believe will make the world a better place, then you need to watch out. Religion exists to point us to the spiritual. The spiritual, by definition, is not the material even if you say that ultimately all is one. Ultimately, all is one, no doubt, but there is nothing ultimate about our life in a body in this world. Here, there very definitely is a split between the spiritual and the material. We have both within us, and when I say within I do mean that because thought, in the normal sense, is material even if it only exists because of the spiritual. It is possible because we are spiritual beings, but in itself it is based on material processes, and is incapable of discerning spiritual reality, so it belongs to the material world. Thus, we have both the spiritual and the material within us, but we are called to overcome the material and submit it to the spiritual, which means the spiritual on its own terms, not as it may be viewed or interpreted by the material component of our being. All true spiritual teachings tell us to renounce this world. Heaven is not here and is not meant to be here, so political triumphs will never bring it about. Wasn't that Judas Iscariot's mistake? He thought Jesus was here to defeat the Romans and restore a Jewish kingdom in this world, but Jesus said that his followers would be hated by the world. He didn't say they would be hated by this world or that world, but by the world, meaning any kind of worldly society. That is because those that follow Jesus see that nothing in this world can lead to eternal life. The very nature of the world is against that, despite its many beauties. To say there is no hope in this world does not mean there is no hope. In fact, it means just the opposite. There is great hope, wonderful cause for hope, but it is in heaven, not here. If you get what you want, you can become satisfied or content, but that means that your motivation for finding the true path to heaven is weakened. So, when things seem to be going your way, be careful. It is hard for the rich to get to heaven, and riches are not just monetary. Recognizing entropy, change, death, as the problem, there have been 3 suggested answers. Bruce Charlton. Even if we, somehow, lived in an utterly perfect society under an utterly ideal political system, there would still be the problem of evil. Even if the problem of evil was, somehow, cured, then there would still be the problem of entropy, of change, degeneration, disease, death. Entropy is the ultimate enemy. Although modern Westerners have lost sight of it, the ultimacy of the problem of entropy has been recognized at least since the earliest known Greek philosophers, and is the focus of the 4th Gospel's account of the purpose and work of Jesus Christ, i.e. at the very heart of Christianity. There have been, I think, 3 suggested ways that purport to solve the ultimate problem of entropy. 1. By stasis. 2. By spirit. 3. By resurrection. The cure by stasis is that entropy is caused by, indeed actually is, change, and is solved by a reality in which there is no change. Eternity is therefore static. The cure by spirit is that entropy is caused by matter, by the material, and therefore is solved by the replacement of matter by immaterial spirit. Including that our death is, ultimately, due to being incarnated, eternity is therefore spiritual. The cure by resurrection is that there must first be death, and after death, for those beings that follow Jesus Christ, there can be a transformation, a remaking, such that we again become incarnated, i.e. made of solid matter, that is everlasting, inhabiting a heaven where we remain ourselves, and in which there is change. The idea of resurrection as a cure for entropy is therefore something new and different from the more ancient ideas of stasis and/or spiritualization. I find the answers of stasis and spirit to be incoherent from a Christian perspective, because they raise the problem of why a loving personal God would compel his children to pass through the entropic phase of mortal incarnation. If stasis, or spirit, are the answer, why bother with all this tedious mucking about in this state of change and as matter? If entropy is to be solved by stasis or spiritualization, why create the problem at all? Why create change? Why create matter? But resurrection has not been understood as a third and qualitatively different solution from stasis and spirit, so that most supposed explanations of resurrection instead revert to variations and combinations of stasis and spirit. A satisfactory and coherent explanation of resurrection needs to include 1. Why death is necessary. Why does God not go directly to the non-entropic state of things? 2. Why our continued mortal life is necessary. If death is necessary to the abolition of entropy, then why don't we die ASAP and get on with the real business of post-mortal resurrected living? It is because I could not find any such explanations, that I was compelled to devise coherent answers for myself, and why I ended up with a new kind of metaphysical Christian theology. Dirty work, what about the necessary evils of civilization? Bruce Charlton. Having grown up in the 1970s, i.e. as a teen, and one who also read a good deal of philosophical/political stuff from the late 19th, early 20th century onwards, I was familiar with the problem that any civilization entails a good deal of dirty work. My interpretation of dirty work is the stuff that needs doing in order for a particular society to sustain itself, but which is the kind of thing that it would be better if nobody did, and therefore it is an ineradicable flaw that somebody has to do it. Whatever the society, real or imagined, and no matter how ideal in terms of what is realistically possible, it was pretty generally recognized, including among honest socialists, who used to exist, and others of the left, that there is always dirty work that needed doing. That dirty work might be coal mining, agricultural drudgery, factory assembly lines, or it might be military and police, prisons and guards, propaganda, and incentivizing. But there is always dirty work to be done, and it was regarded as a genuine problem how to square this necessity with the ideal society, because it is a problem with all societies. Even among those who acknowledged the problem, there were always people who supposed that kicking the can a bit further down the road constituted an answer. Replacing laboring people with machines was one instance, because it replaced the problem of doing exhausting physical labor, with instead a vastly complex system of multinational, multi-personal, economics and trade, including systems of education, training, factory work, transportation etc., all of which was just as systemic, just as mandatory, hence, ultimately coerced, as the toiling peasant. The same problems apply to any imaginable system of religion that might be integrated with any ideal society. The building and maintenance of churches, the provision of religious professionals, priests, theologians, administrators etc., and the systems needed to provide these, education, training, discipline, monitoring etc., a system of laws and rules for the religion. The problem of dirty work in any realistically conceivable religion is indeed very extensive. So this problem of the necessarily coercive and dirty nature of every realistically conceivable society was a constant problem for those who were honest, and who also hoped and intended to improve human life on this earth. The key terms above include realistic and honest, because, starting in the middle 60s, and beginning to become dominant through the 1970s, it became evident that it had become acceptable, indeed mainstream in public and intellectual discourse, to dispose of the problem of dirty work by being unrealistic and dishonest. For examples, by denying there was a necessary problem, or removing the problem by hand-waving. That is certainly the point we have now reached, and for a long time. The discussions of sex and sexuality, or race, are prime instances. The favored outcomes are merely wish fulfillment daydreams. Realistic evaluation, for example in terms of negative outcomes of policy, inevitable compromises, necessary and unavoidable flaws, is not just neglected but prohibited. This began with the denial of adverse personal and social outcomes from a system that allowed, then encouraged, extramarital sex, promiscuity, normalized cohabitation, and introduced no-fault divorce, and went on from there as the sexual revolution expanded without limit. Environment is another instance. In the early mid-70s it was acknowledged that preservation of nature and enhancement of the natural environment would require a lower population, a lower standard of living, a great simplification of life, fewer and less complex machines, with less consumption and travel and so forth. But currently all such dirty work inevitabilities are just left out, blocked from discussion, and boosteristic, vague, wishful thinking reigns unopposed. Much the same applies among modern Christians. While it used to be very generally accepted that there is a large dirty work aspect to system-integrated church Christianity, of all denominations, although the main problems differed for each, that this was an ineradicably very mixed solution to the problem of religion, nowadays such matters are left out of discussion. Probably in consequence, the dirty work, systemic aspects of the Christian churches have almost completely taken over, and everything else, the actual religion that is supposed to be provided by the apparatus of organization, is so marginalized as to be all but invisible, or, as in the Birdemic, eliminated until further notice. Furthermore, those who advocate a return to a society rooted in orthodox traditionalism seem to be living in an unrealistic and dishonest fantasy daydream, where either there are no dirty work aspects of their desired theocratic system, or else these necessary flaws are reinterpreted as good things. This problem applies to all actual and possible Christian churches. System always entails dirty work. What I mean is that stuff which used to be known as necessary evils, are either no longer regarded as necessary or, more often, no longer regarded as evil. Usually on the basis that the system advocated is, overall, judged better than the totalitarian, materialist, evil-motivated system in place currently, which is a very low bar to leap. And this applies pretty much across the board, including among far too many Christians. Dishonesty and unrealism are institutionalized, and not just accepted, but required in public discourse, even among dissenting minorities. So I have circled back to my old, well-worn point about the necessity of honesty, if anything is to be accomplished from the situation we now inhabit. And the further point I wish to make is that, in a world where honesty is neither valued nor permitted, this is a matter for each individual to do for himself. Self-honesty. Striving for honesty about everything, with oneself, for oneself, and God. Personal responsibility in all, or as many as possible, things, in other words. Saving the Appearances, excellent audiobook version read by Aaron Parker. Bruce Charlton. A complete audiobook version of Owen Barfield's most important book Saving the Appearances has been recorded on YouTube by Aaron Parker. This is an excellent resource, because Saving the Appearances, although extremely well written, has often proved to be difficult for people to understand. At least, many people, including myself, seem to have misunderstood the book and failed to recognize its exceptionally deep and transformative implications on a first reading. I think this is likely to be helped by Aaron Parker's impressive narration, which is highly engaged with the text, and articulated with an emphasis and modulation that makes it both easier to maintain concentration, and to grasp the argument. Saving the Appearances has been a life-changing book for many people. If you have never yet tried it, or tried and didn't get it, then here is a new kind of opportunity for you. A God who aims to help create more divinity. Francis Berger. I cannot believe in a God who cannot create more gods. I cannot believe in a God for whom such an endeavor is a logical and metaphysical impossibility. Wait, let me refine that a little. I cannot believe in a God who cannot help to create more divinity, help because divinity creation is ultimately a co-creative effort. I assume the expansion of divinity to be the overarching goal of creation, with Jesus serving as the most personal and relatable example of divine co-creation. Creation makes little sense to me if God is not actively seeking his divine other or does not yearn for the manifestation of divine others. Jesus' offer of heaven makes little sense to me if it does not offer the possibility of divinity expansion. And the overall point of mortal life makes little sense to me if one rejects that offer. What prevents war in heaven? Or, the necessity for death and resurrection. Bruce Charlton. The phrase war in heaven is common enough, sometimes used to describe a rebellion of Lucifer and the demons against God, and a subsequent war among spiritual beings with Michael the archangel leading the forces on God's side. Yet, if we really think about it, war in heaven is nonsense, an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. Because, if there is war, then it isn't heaven. And if there is a heaven, then there cannot be war in it, nor even the possibility of war. If the war of God and angels versus demonic rebels did indeed happen in the time before Christ, and I believe something of that sort did happen, albeit it was and still is probably continuous, rather than a finite war, then it was not a war in heaven. It was as a war in the first creation which was not and cannot be heaven, not a war in Jesus Christ's second creation. Heaven did not exist, and was not even claimed to exist, until Jesus Christ. It was Jesus that made heaven, and made heaven a possible destination for men. But the trouble was and still is, that Jesus made heaven on the other side of death. Jesus insisted that men must die, as did he, and be born again in order to dwell in heaven. This has never been popular. People do not want to wait until after death. They want heaven here and now, or as soon as possible. They want to dwell in heaven as they are, and not as they become after death. They want heaven on earth. Why then did Jesus insist that men must die? Why not abolish death? Well, if we assume Jesus was both good and competent, then we must assume that death was necessary for heaven to exist, necessary for men to live forever and go to heaven, necessary in order that heaven actually be heaven. And this can be understood by considering how war in heaven is prevented. While some kind of powerful government could suppress dissent, detect and punish rebels etc., this would not be heaven. Being a thwarted, or brainwashed, rebel is not a heavenly state. War in heaven can only be ruled out eternally if not a single one of the denizens of heaven ever want war, and this situation must be eternal. In other words, the inhabitants of heaven must, of their very nature, spontaneously, by their own fundamental desires and motivations, always and forever desire to live in love and harmony with God, and with each other. The problem was how to arrive at this situation, given that men, and all other beings, just are free agents. The problem is, how can free agents become eternally good? And my answer is that men need to be able to make permanent their commitments, their choices, their deepest desires. Here on earth we cannot stick to our commitments, cannot stick to our choices. New Year's resolutions get broken. The grandiose hopes of qualitative self-reform and betterment in a new Christian convert never work out. The old Adam is ineradicable, as the Apostle Paul famously complained. We may passionately want to do this or that, or to be good, loving persons, but always we get distracted, or sick or older, our motives or mood change, circumstances change, and over and again we want something different, and end by doing something else altogether. Even especially the greatest saints are self-acknowledged to be great, almost continuous, sinners, by the truest standards of sin, sin as something like deviation from the loving nature of divine creation. For there to be a heaven, men need to be able to choose God, divine creation, love and all that is good, and to choose this only and this forever. The way this happens is resurrection. We can therefore consider resurrection to be the way that we are enabled to make our commitments permanent. And resurrection first requires death. Thus resurrected beings can live forever in heaven without war. Resurrection includes a permanent choice, an eternally binding commitment, by which men are, thanks to Jesus Christ, now able to make for ourselves. It will surely be asked, but why can't we have resurrection without death? The only real answer is, because that is the nature of things. If we want resurrection, we must die. It makes sense to me that resurrection can only be after death, because it entails a kind of permission to be remade as eternal beings, and although resurrection is a material process as well as spiritual, the process is essentially spiritual, because the material is a subset of the spiritual. I.e., originally there were only spiritual beings, the material came later in creation. All materiality is also spiritual, but there can be and is spiritual being that is not material. I conceive of death as a kind of dissolution, or dissolving of my beingness from its current temporarily incarnated, embodied, level of creation, back towards a primal and immaterial, only spiritual, simplicity that is a barely conscious mere existence. I envisage resurrection as redirecting the death process by which only and all of that which is good in me is taken, retained, rebuilt into the resurrected me. The resurrected me is still me, because it is a transformation of my eternal being, but it is only remade of that which is good, which is heaven compatible and heaven sustaining. The resurrected me will be eternal because this selective process retains only that which is harmonious and loving, and leaves behind forever all that would have potential to generate dissent, rebellion or war against that which makes heaven heavenly. In other words, all of my mortal self that leads to death, all evil, and all entropy, is left behind in the process of resurrection. Therefore after resurrection creation is unopposed and life is everlasting. How this selection process during resurrection actually happens, I guess to be the point at which the Christian imperative of following Jesus Christ comes in. It may be as if we are continually guided through the process of resurrection, knowing what must be retained, what must be let go and shed, by the very simple matter of love. The discernment of what to keep, what to discard, comes from that love which motivates anyone who permanently desires heaven, and the outer direction of that love to Jesus Christ and what he offers us. In different words, it is the loving and personal attention of Jesus Christ towards our souls during the process of dying, that enables resurrection, and which enables heaven to exist. And which enables heaven to be heavenly, including that there can never be any desire for, or possibility of, war in heaven. Hat tip: Francis Berger's comment that a possible motivation for those who insist on an omni-God is that they fear that anything less than an omni-God will not always and forever be able to defeat beings that might strive to usurp creation. God therefore, supposedly, desires to retain an infinite and qualitative gulf between himself and all created beings. Or rather, this gulf justice, and a consequence is that nobody and nothing can subvert creation. Such a line of reasoning is, I think, just an extreme case of the much more general problem stated here: how can heaven stay heavenly when its inhabitants are free agents? The above is my understanding of how this is so, and some the consequences. Once it is understood that the denizens of heaven can, by free and irrevocable choice, permanently be fully in harmonious accord with God's creative purposes and methods, then there is no reason why men cannot rise to a level of divinity on a par with God the primary creator, and join with God as partners in the work of creation. The current orgy of virtual Schadenfreude. Bruce Charlton. The current online orgy of virtual Schadenfreude, triggered by media reports of the activities of the new US presidential administration, is a dismaying spectacle in many ways, from my Christian perspective. Schadenfreude describes the spiteful emotion of gratification at the real or imagined sufferings of others, typically of one's enemies. Real or imagined is relevant, since the current sufferings are substantially imagined, being learned of via news media reports and governmental/bureaucratic announcements. That is why I inserted the word virtual, because the information on the sufferings is substantially indirect, second-hand, and obtained via mass/social media, and from state sources. At least two things should be said about this online delight. The first is to clarify that reports of sufferings will almost certainly be misleading. The second, and more important, that the reported activities being celebrated are almost wholly negative, and destructive in nature, therefore not driven by any explicit and conscious, positive Christian motivation. I have been deeply suspicious of claims of destruction of the managerial bureaucracy, since I had inside experience of such events about 30 years ago, within the UK National Health Service. The government of that era claimed to be determined to cut red tape, including severely reducing the particular layer of bureaucracy within which I was working. Official announcements from the specific layer of NHS bureaucracy also claimed, and complained, that it was being reduced severely. About 150 jobs were supposedly to be cut from a single office complex where I worked, and official returns to this effect were submitted. The news media duly reported the 150 jobs cut. Yet those on the inside knew that this was a kind of theatre for public consumption. In reality, hardly any jobs were cut, and these were almost exclusively among those who wanted to leave anyway and were grateful for severance pay. Nearly all of the 150 sacked/let go were redeployed within the larger organization, and/or rehired into almost the same jobs, shortly after the big announcement of cuts. The message is that, when you hear or read about job cuts, layoffs, closures etc., all this kind of stuff may quite easily be faked, but faked in a way that is not detectable without detailed inside knowledge. The deeper problem with this current celebrations of destruction is that of the underlying motivation. Because the difference between virtue and sin, between good and evil, is essentially that of motivation, rather than specific action. A motivation for destruction as such, is anti-divine creation, hence an evil motivation, and therefore leads to more and greater evil. And this applies pretty much for anything that might be destroyed, almost regardless of how useless or evil it is. An historical comparison could be the dissolution of the monasteries that happened in England under the rule of Henry VIII. The Roman Catholic Church itself, and its religious orders in particular, monasteries, friaries, priories, nunneries, owned a vast and still increasing proportion of the national wealth, from memory, something between a third and a half of the land. Church abuses were rife and widely experienced by the English population. There was a good deal of exploitation, luxury, self-indulgence, and political activity, and apparently much less, although certainly still a significant amount, of asceticism, scholarship, piety, charity, and virtue. Therefore, there was no shortage of those among the English who celebrated, even when they did not personally benefit from, the truly colossal appropriation, violence and destruction that followed. My impression is that there was a good deal of tacit, if not active, public support for the dissolution, as well as senior political, and a large segment of religious, leadership involvement. A great deal, therefore, of Schadenfreude was evident in the dissolution. For instance, when the last major abbey, in Glastonbury, was closed and demolished, and the greatest monastic library in England was destroyed, and its abbot and 2 other senior clerics were publicly hung on top of Glastonbury Tor, it seems that the local population were pleased to observe their ex-landlords get what was coming to them. Yet the dissolution of the monasteries was a national catastrophe, especially for the middle and poorer classes, from which it took England generations to recover, if indeed it ever did recover. More than a century of terribly destructive religious wars and exterminations were initiated. For many decades, there were almost no schools or hospitals, and no organized provision for relief of the poor. My simple point is that when goals are negative and destruction is the primary aim, and when this is unacknowledged, unrepented, spiritual disaster will surely ensue. Because this is, in effect, a celebration and endorsement of evil. No amount of negative action ever amounts to a positive strategy, and almost all current self-styled positive motivations are merely double negative simulations. Or else, like Western nationalism as of 2025, almost wholly wishful, conjectural, hence in practice very secondary to other motives, and far too feeble to be effectual. With respect to the native populations of Western nations in 2025, any motivation that is truly good, positive, virtuous, absolutely needs to be consciously chosen a grassroots/bottom-up phenomenon. Because, however differently things were in the past, good cannot now be done covertly nor in a top-down fashion. So that all fantasies of covert positive top-down agendas among the ruling elites are impossible, as well as unreal. In sum, the current orgy of online schadenfreude may concern much that is merely virtual, and by its celebration of negative and destructive motivations, is very likely, from a Christian point of view, to prove multivalently corrupting of those who engage in it. As, indeed, seems to be the case. Insincere otherworldly prayers coated in supposedly good this worldly concerns. Francis Berger. Write posts about how I yearn for the death of the current pope so that the church can get a better pope, and then rationalize that yearning by emphasizing the ultimacy of Christ's church and underscoring that I am praying for the ailing pontiff's soul and the execution of God's will, which, apparently, makes everything spiritually spick and span. Sounds virtuous to me. Hat tip Dr. Charlton's post on Schadenfreude. The living image of the eternal. William Wildblood. Truth is beyond form and expression, but for religion to be comprehensible it must be grounded in form. Religious forms can take many varieties which approximate to that which they are trying to express to a greater or lesser degree. Some forms capture something of the reality behind them while others distort it, sometimes unacceptably so. The question then arises: what is the best form, the one that comes nearest to revealing the truth that lies behind all genuine religion? Before answering that, we must accept that different forms suit different people. That is to say, people of different temperaments and from different cultural backgrounds. It would be unrealistic to think that the whole world should follow one particular form any more than that they should speak one language, and it is probably not a good idea either, as different forms can express different aspects of truth. None express the whole, even all together can't express more than a tiny fraction of the whole, but they can complement each other by their particular focal points. This may not be necessary from the purely spiritual perspective, but it can be helpful. No doubt everyone thinks his own religion is best, and it may be for him. On the other hand, it may not. It may simply be a religion one is born into, or one that suits one's strengths or weaknesses or prejudices or preconceptions. Over the course of my spiritual life, pompous phrase, but it can't be helped in this context, which is now some 47 years, I have investigated many, I am tempted to say most, spiritual paths. Not as a follower but by reading about them and exploring their forms and practices. It's fascinating to see how human beings have approached the numinous. So many similarities and so many differences. While recognizing the validity of many, I have my favorites, but there are also some I think are inspired from lower levels, either originally or through infiltration over the years. Some are even a mix of the true and the false. Quite a few are, in fact. However, there is one clear winner. I know it's not a competition, but in a way, it is. Obviously, that is Christianity, and not so much because of the religion or religions that have arisen in Christ's name, but because of him. Christ is the face and form of God, God revealed in a human being, God embodied. And, while we're at it, let us point out that the image of God himself is another form that encapsulates hidden truth. As God the Father, creator of heaven and earth, this image draws the mind and heart up to the realm of pure spiritual light in a way that lesser images do not. The very word God brings together amorphous ideas and feelings and intuitions in the human head and heart, and molds them into something tangible, something that the mind can latch onto, to which it can respond and with which it can engage. Jesus Christ is the perfect spiritual form, the one above all others. First of all, because he is a living person, and spiritual reality is personal before it is impersonal, the opposite to what the sophisticated believe. And secondly, because he is the only spiritual figure totally without flaw, without sin, as it is said. He reflects the spiritual world without any corrupt influence of this world. You can say that about no one and nothing else. Certainly, there are many other inspiring spiritual figures and philosophies from before the time of Christ and after him. But he is without peer and incomparable in his truthfulness. I do not doubt that non-Christian spiritual approaches can bring their followers to God, and, for that matter, many ostensible Christian ones might fail in that, but Christ is and remains the way, the truth and the life. He is the revelation of what this excellent essay calls the single, supreme, eternal creator deity or first principle, born into the Jewish race but come for all people. Systemic social problems, the implicit utopianism of the left and the implicit selfishness of the right. Bruce Charlton. In any possible and realistically imaginable society in this mortal life on earth, there will be situations and people who are having an absolutely and/or relatively miserable time of it. This may be due to the necessity for dirty work, or it may be due to all manner of negative aspects of any system. Because no matter how overall optimal a system of society may be, it will be imperfect, it will include groups and/or individuals who are less favored at least, and usually groups/individuals who are systematically disfavored. By my understanding, leftism began in the late 1700s with movements such as abolition and pacifism, and gathered strength through the 1800s with many varieties of socialism, before developing the current new leftism, sexual politics such as feminism, anti-racism, environmentalism, transhumanism etc., to dominate from the later 1960s. Early leftism was often explicitly utopian, positing an ideal society that was sometimes claiming to be a possible paradise, even if not quite heaven on earth. In recent decades, leftism has abandoned explicit utopianism, but retains a wholly implicit, never stated, assumption of the perfectibility of human society, from which stance proceeds its critique of any degree of absolute, or relative inequality, or suffering. In other words, leftism is rooted in a denial of the systematic imperfection of all possible human societies, which is why leftism is insatiable, and leads to the state of permanent revolution that has prevailed over the past 6 decades. All problems that the left focuses upon are always regarded as systemic and requiring systemic change, then, because all possible systems have problems, the left. To take racism in the USA as an example, at first the focus was upon laws and practices that excluded or disadvantaged, so that opposite affirmative action laws were introduced. The focus then shifted to unequal outcomes, so that quotas were introduced. Then the focus shifted to individuals' subjective feelings of oppression, disrespect, neglect etc., microaggressions. Then to a requirement for positive acts of group affirmation, admiration, celebration, and so forth. What all of these imply without ever stating, is that any degree of imperfection in a social system is intolerable and ought to lead to system change, with the unstated assumption that this will lead towards a perfect system where no such problems will occur. This strong assumption of perfectibility would probably be denied, yet there is always an assumption that things can and will be improved overall by each proposed or actual system change, and that there is no limit to such improvability. Such assumptions and denials inevitably lead to systematic dishonesty, which has been such a major feature of Western social development over the past several decades, until here and now those with power think and behave wholly manipulatively with respect to their implicit left agenda, and are not even trying to be honest about anything. I regard this implicit assumption of societal perfectibility as an almost inevitable consequence of the atheistic this worldly materialism of Western societies, in certain personality types. I am thinking of those people who regard suffering as the main human problem, or who judge a society on how it treats what they regard as its most disadvantaged members. These are the leftists, and are in practice systematically dishonest. Other atheistic this worldly materialists are less concerned about suffering, and more interested in optimizing peace, prosperity, comfort, convenience, and gratification. These are those who regard themselves as on the right. They accept the inevitability of imperfection and the necessity for compromise in systems, but disagree among themselves on what social system is optimal, and or how to attain it. In practice, rightists are systematically selfish, i.e. favoring a social system that they believe favors themselves, plus minus favoring people like themselves. As I see it, the only alternative is to adopt a Christian not atheist, spiritual not materialist, and heaven-focused not this world-focused, perspective on all possible social systems. Soviet and Socialist Origins of the British Folk Music Revival. Bruce Charlton. I'm reading an oral history of folk clubs, called Singing from the Floor, by J.P. Bean, 2014, which institutions were the main manifestation of the British folk revival from the middle 1950s until the late 1970s. I knew this movement pretty well and participated somewhat, towards the end of this era, and perhaps because I came late to it, I had not previously realized the extent to which the trend was dependent upon the Communist Party, in effect the government of the USSR, and socialist trades unions, for planning, funding, publicity and organization. This top-down and social engineering aspect of the British folk revival is perfectly clear-cut, not hidden, and was always openly acknowledged, albeit the fact that the activities of UK communism were primarily as a tool of USSR foreign policy, was never generally recognized. Like so much of popular music and popular culture generally, it turns out that the public face and administrators of folk music, aside from the always present actually folk musicians, such as farm workers and miners, were the intelligence branches of the Eastern Bloc, and their sympathizers and collaborators within the UK establishment and labour movements. All of which is ironic considering, this was supposed to be a grassroots, bottom-up movement, emanating from the folk and representing the ideas and ideals of the secret people of Britain, the often nameless working masses. But I suppose this always has been standard operating procedure for the left, who are always appointing themselves spokesmen on behalf of somebody else. In the end, the movement outgrew its roots, and the aspects of folk music that I most liked were either disconnected from or hostile to the original Soviet agent controllers such as Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger, or Al Lloyd. But there is no doubt in my mind that a major aspect of the folk movement was covert agenda-driven, was upper and middle class in origin and actuality, and that this strategy was highly successful in its presumed political aims of permeating many performers and audience with a particular worldview and assumptions. And what applied to folk music, top-down, organized and funded for strategic political purposes by leftist sources, was analogously true, although probably with less direct Soviet influence, and a more Western intelligence impulse, for the much larger pop culture of Britain. Thus were built into people, at an early and formative stage of life, and especially associated with enjoyment, happy memories and daydreams during the coming-of-age years of teenage and young adulthood, ideas and ideals that have been for many decades a cultural compulsion and obsession in the West, and which consequently still exert a near monopoly in large sectors of the population in the UK. Job done. Are explanations really necessary? Must we personally seek understanding? Bruce Charlton. It's often been recommended that we should cease to seek explanations, which are, anyway, always wrong by ultimate standards, and should instead just accept what is. It is said, we should acknowledge that we cannot know, and stop striving for something unattainable, and very probably misleading. Indeed, it is often asserted that searching for explanations is just a waste of time, because it will fail to find anything with which we can be contented. Sooner or later, we will give up the quest, so why not do it sooner? Another way of saying the same thing is that it is the activity and process of seeking which justifies the exercise. For instance, this is a common New Age suggestion, the ideal of being a perpetual spiritual seeker. However, on examination this advice reduces to meaning that seeking explanations, discovering, trying out, then dropping one after the other, is justified merely because it passes the time before death fairly pleasantly, and relatively harmlessly. It reduces spirituality from a matter of primary human concern, to the level of a hobby. Even since I became a Christian, I have often tried to stop myself seeking explanations, tried to be contented with some kind of simple faith. I have tried this with more than one Christian denomination/church. Tried to stop myself questioning and trying to understand, on the basis that such activity was futile at best, destructive of faith at worst, because it never seemed to reach an end point. Yet, especially, the events of 2020 hammered home why, in a world such as that we inhabit, which is a world where public discourse is near monopolistically dominated by evil affiliated powers, the seeking of explanations and personal understanding is now almost essential for Christians, if Christians are not to be led away from salvation and into voluntarily embracing damnation. I have noticed again and again that the attempt, here and now I mean, and I note that it was not always and everywhere thus, to be content without explanations, to seek to rest upon the mystery of existence, are attitudes that have long since been weaponized as a tool of Satan. It seems to be a psychosocial fact that the only matters upon which people actually do cease to seek understanding, and are contented without explanation, on which they rest comfortably as if upon the ultimate mysteriousness of existence. In practice, the only much matters are those where knowledge/ideas/theories/facts are supported by the civilizational, media, official, bureaucratic, institutional consensus. In practice, therefore, the advice to cease seeking personal understanding is equivalent to recommending that we live in accordance with the dominant social consensus. There are many theoretical possibilities for conducting our spiritual lives, but in practice it seems that the only alternative to accepting social consensus is personally to keep seeking understanding and a satisfactory explanation. So, I would remind myself, and suggest to others, that in the situation of a modern man of 2025 it is a snare to cease striving for understanding. And that we ought instead to discover for ourselves, and to our personal satisfaction, explanations for every aspect of existence that we regard as important. Of course, as always, such a search must strive to be completely honest, and must Christianly motivated, because if we seek, whether consciously or unconsciously, any this worldly and hedonic outcome such as comfort or convenience, therapy or thrills, then our explanations will be expedient merely, and we shall not achieve solid understanding. The only real alternative to a personal quest for explaining and understanding the essentials of our faith is to accept spiritually lethal rule by consensus external values, which is embrace the side of damnation in the spiritual war of this world. Note added, the relationship between understanding and explanation is synergistic. We must first understand, then try to explain, primarily to ourselves, and to our own satisfaction. Difficulties with explaining may reveal lack of understanding, or the attempt to be clear in our explanation may reveal problems with that understanding. Therefore, explanation is a check, a test, and one that may lead back to searching for better understanding. Like son, unlike father, King Henry VIII versus Henry VII. Bruce Charlton. It is a sad reflection on the English that Henry VIII continues to get continual attention, and a kind of sneaking admiration, for his, unsurpassed except by William I, rapacious brutality in the dissolution of the monasteries, together with his achievement of having 6 wives. Yet Henry VIII left England far weaker, poor and more internally conflicted than he found the nation. By contrast, Henry VIII's father, Henry Tudor, was one of the best of English monarchs, the last king of merry England. This is not recognized for various reasons. Henry Tudor's character was shrewd and compassionate, he was not larger than life like his son. Also, English people have forgotten the colossal destructiveness of the Wars of the Roses, decades of selfish and self-destructive civil war between Lancastrian and Yorkist aristocrats, to which Henry VII put an end. As a measure of destructiveness, when the English population was only about 2 to 3 million, the Roses' Wars were a terrible drain on the fittest and most productive of the national population. For instance, the Battle of Towton, hardly known by anyone nowadays, probably killed something like 4% or more of the military age and physically able men, e.a. something like 25,000, in a single horrific day of mutual slaughter. But the saddest reflection on our national memory is related to the marriage question. While Henry VIII married 6 times, plus mistresses, and illegitimate children, of which he killed 2, and divorced, technically had annulled, another 2, in contrast, his father Henry Tudor had what has been described as perhaps the most genuinely loving royal marriage in English history. This, despite that the marriage was originally a political alliance between the houses of Lancaster, Henry, and York, his wife Elizabeth. Henry seems, indeed, to have been that most unusual thing among monarchs, a loving husband and father. The husband and wife were devastated by the premature death of his first son and heir Arthur, Prince of Wales at age 15, and then Henry was even more affected by the death of his wife, after which he was never the same again. Nonetheless, and despite the fault of a somewhat miserly greed in his final widowed years, Henry VII left England a stronger, richer, more peaceful, unified and powerful nation, and the English monarch probably the most secure and dominant leader in Europe. Most of which achievement, except domestic power, his son then exploited and dissipated for personal gratification, with adverse consequences that extended for several generations. If nations usually get the monarchs they deserve, then the relative English reputations of these 2 Henrys may partly explain how this happens. What is authentic freedom? Francis Berger. The more I think about it, the more I realize that authentic freedom has very little to do with free will choosing, obedience to authority, being properly informed, or rational/logical thinking. A man experiences authentic freedom when his thoughts and acts are thoughts and acts of love. Not the correct choice between love and non-love, not submission to some logical argument in favor of love, as if such could exist, not the desire to feel reassured or flee into fantasy. Authentic freedom exists only in thoughts and acts of love. Perhaps that helps to explain why nothing tortures and burdens man more. Schadenfreude derangement syndrome. Bruce Charlton. The current orgy of Schadenfreude continues to escalate, energized a few days ago by a staged, acted and broadcast PR pseudo-spat over the Fire Nation war, a news event which has been uncritically accepted at face value, and thereby ecstatically celebrated, by, apparently, hordes of people, individuals who, just a few weeks ago, expressed deep skepticism over the machinations of mainstream politics and the mass media. Yet another litmus test massively failed. It is becoming clear that the double negative agenda is alive and well, dominating and sweeping aside what has thereby been revealed as a shallow, feeble, self-gratifying, and this worldly Christianity. Double negative values are a hallmark of the left, which is united only by its opposition to, ultimately, God and divine creation. The self-identified political right, including advocates of an imaginary and impossible nationalism, have recently come out as crypto-leftists, which, indeed, is the inevitable convergence of all primarily this worldly and double negative ideals. In sum, the right is united only by its rejection of the left, i.e. particular labeled individuals and institutions, such that the only powerful source of right triumphalism is when their left-identified enemies appear to be getting humiliated and destroyed. Note, in our world, all is of the left, except where religion is put first, and where that religion is motivationally rooted beyond this world. There is a strong lure in religion that seems to combine success and status, power and prestige, pride and self-esteem, progress and historical inevitability, with aspects of real Christianity that is not of this world. The proposed syncresis of this and next world benefits appears in many guises through history, and dominates much of online Christian discourse, which is the reason behind current ecstasies of virtual Schadenfreude. The prosperity gospel is indeed much more widespread than its crudest evangelists. The idea that the path to economic, or sexual, success lies via Christianity is a very popular and influential one online. Of course, Christianity must and should be of this world as well as the next, not least because the incarnation and mortal life of Jesus Christ is evidence of this. In other words, our mortal lives have purpose for as long as they are sustained by God. So a retreat from the world is not even a theoretical option for Christians, we must and should engage. But, in a civilization and society so completely built upon materialism and the denial of the spirit, in a world dominated by corrupt, and demonic-allied, institutions, it ought to be perfectly clear and evident that goodness cannot, therefore will not, emanate from, nor be gifted top-down by, those with institutional and official power/wealth/social status. It ought to be evident that politico-media events intended to demonstrate the humiliation or destruction of people, organizations, nations are not going to be evidence of, nor harbingers of, goodness. Indeed, the likely reality behind the facade of apparent destruction is not even difficult to discern for those with a bit of accurate knowledge who stand back from the contrived frenzy, even when these people have no religious basis. In a geopolitical world of puppet leaders, the spectacle of one puppet berating another for the cameras should be obvious as what it is, a puppet show. The spiritual war of this world is essentially about hearts and minds, and the great aim of the various factions of evil is not to impose physical/material slavery or misery, but to induce individuals to choose to commit themselves, hearts and minds, to one or another of the agendas of evil. Evil is only spiritually effective when it has been freely embraced. That is why our enthusiasm, support, and hope are so assiduously cultivated by the establishment. And that embrace of evil is precisely what we are observing, in real time, on a day-by-day basis. People who were, until recently, apparently Christian, are changing sides, abandoning salvation as their primary goal. And instead they are committing more and more of their support, energies, enthusiasm, efforts, and, worst of all, hopes, on what is at root a negative, destructive, demon-motivated agenda. We cannot get to there from here. William Wildblood. When people take seriously the condemnations of the modern world, its various ideologies, its materialism, its addiction to technology and all the rest, they might ask, what do we need to do? How can we get back on a proper spiritual track? The answer is simple. On an individual level, this is possible, and a return to first principles with the appropriate beliefs and practices will help to realign the soul with reality. 4. Make no mistake, the vast majority of human beings today are completely divorced from reality and living in a degraded fantasy world. And that is why that on a societal level it is no longer possible to get back on track, and has not been for some time. Things are just too far gone. As a culture we cannot get to where we should be from where we are now. When something has grown and become established to the degree that modernity has, it cannot be put right. It can only be completely uprooted, and then we must start again from scratch, or if not scratch then something not far off. This became even more obvious to me than it already was during the course of writing my recent book on the end times. When I examined certain modern ideologies, it was clear that these were too entrenched in the contemporary mind to be dealt with effectively. The mind will have to receive a great shock to exorcise these thought forms which have sunk so deeply into consciousness that they cannot be erased without a massive upheaval. Even when many people turn to spirituality, they take these ideas with them, and see spirituality through the prism of modernity and its ideological assumptions. This is the legacy of centuries of actual or effective materialism, coupled with the degradation of consciousness that occurs in the end times. No new political movement can save us. Not even a revival of religion could do that. Such things might correct some of the more extreme forms of crazy thought and behavior, but they cannot at this stage address fundamental problems, other than superficially. This presents a dilemma. Does recognizing the reality that real change is no longer possible mean we do nothing, or should we at least try to do something while understanding that can never really succeed, though it might make some improvements here and there? Everybody must make his or her own mind up on that score. There is no ready-made answer. The basics of life are simple and will come naturally into view when we are faithful to first principles, the chief of which is to love or, at least, acknowledge God and respect His order, both natural and spiritual. If we get that right, everything else will fall into place. If we fail in that, then nothing will ever be right. It's like trying to keep the outside of the circle in place when you have lost touch with the center. I have sometimes been asked in response to a criticism of the modern world, well, what would you do to make things better? All I can do is point out that this is an impossible question to answer. When the rot has set in so deeply, there is nothing you can do. You can't say you should revive Christianity or bring back paganism or abolish communism or democracy or feminism or whatever it might be. In the case of the former, their time of spiritual effectiveness on the societal level has passed. In the case of the latter, they are indelible parts of the modern psyche. We cannot return to where we were, and any attempt to do so would fail. All we can do is get our individual houses in order and wait for whatever is coming to clean up the mess. Or, as Jesus said, watch and pray. This is not a counsel of despair but one of promise. This world was never meant to be the main focus of our lives, meaning our lives in the whole. Eventually, this world will be redeemed and raised up into spirit. The whole of matter will be transformed as Jesus' body was at the ascension. But that is a long way off. For the time being, the world serves mostly as a training ground for the soul, and one of its functions is as a platform to push against in the search for spirit. Therefore, the fact of its imminent large-scale purification is something to look on with hope. Destruction on one level will lead to resurrection on another. When the degraded environment and corrupted human consciousness are purified by what is to come, then a new humanity can arise, cleansed of the dirt it has accumulated over the last several centuries if not millennia. Love, freedom, truth, and their relationship. Francis Berger. A response to comment Lucas left on yesterday's post. I assume that freedom is an uncreated, primordial, default setting inherent in beings. Thus, all beings were essentially free in the primordial chaos prior to creation, but this freedom was dormant, meaningless, isolated. I see the honing of freedom as an overarching purpose of creation, the orientation of our inherent freedom toward love, love of the self and others, because without others we can never truly know or love ourselves, that is, alignment with God's creative purposes. In this sense, our freedom is a commitment to that which truly makes us free, something that transcends our innate purposeless freedom. At least, that's how I see it now. That's how love, freedom, and truth make sense to me metaphysically. Note added. An excerpt from Badiaf's Slavery and Freedom, one I have cited many times, helps bring the above into focus.
Christ was a free man, the freest of the sons of men. He was free from the world, he was bound only by love.
The juxtaposition and apparent paradox of being the freest of the sons of men yet still bound by love strikes at the heart of what I attempted to express in yesterday's post, in which I suggested that authentic freedom exists only in thoughts and acts of love.